The gray dawn over Royal Air Force Kimbolton arrived cold on the 30th of July, 1943. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth squeezed himself through the narrow access tunnel into the rear turret of a B-17 flying fortress named Tandaleo. He was 24. Behind him lay 12 bombing runs over German-occupied territory. His gun camera footage had confirmed 3 enemy aircraft destroyed. Intelligence briefings warned that more than 300 Luftwaffe interceptors had been deployed along today's flight path to Kassel. The workspace waiting for Aruth measured 4 feet across and 5 feet deep. He lowered himself onto what resembled a bicycle saddle mounted to the turret floor. Twin Browning .50 caliber heavy machine guns jutted through the curved plexiglass transparency. The bomber would climb to 25,000 feet. At that altitude, air temperature would reach 60 below zero. Only his electrically powered heated suit prevented fatal hypothermia. Within the 8th Air Force, rear gunner duty earned a reputation as the most isolating assignment in modern warfare. Aruth occupied his station cut off from his 9 crewmates by 40 feet of aluminum airframe, nobody to speak with during combat, no assistance when equipment failed or enemy fire struck. Simply 1 airman, 2 weapons, and whatever the German Air Force chose to send. The casualty statistics told their own story. Throughout summer 1943, typical B-17 crews completed 11 bombing missions before their aircraft went down, before crew members died, or before capture. Among all bomber crew positions, only the bellyball turret gunner faced worse survival odds. Luftwaffe fighter tactics emphasized attacks from behind. The rearmost position absorbed initial incoming fire. Through July, the 379th Bombardment Group had written off 9 bombers in 60 days. 90 airmen gone. The problem boiled down to geometry. German pilots recognized that stern attacks provided maximum time for accurate gunnery. Consider a Messerschmitt Bf-109 accelerating toward a bomber from dead astern at 350 miles per hour. That pilot enjoyed nearly 10 seconds to line up his gun sight and press his firing button before flashing past. The defending tail gunner had those identical 10 seconds to hit an enemy fighter when combined closing velocities approached 600 miles per hour. Most American tail gunners failed. The Focke-Wulf 190 mounted formidable armament. 2 20mm autocannons plus 2 13mm heavy machine guns. 1 sustained firing pass could obliterate the plexiglass turret, kill the defender, and cripple the bomber's tail controls. Official Army Air Force's training doctrine taught defensive gunners patience and ammunition conservation. Hold fire until the enemy closed within range. Take careful aim. Squeeze controlled bursts. Preserve ammunition. The theory appeared sound in stateside classrooms. In combat over Nazi Germany, waiting until 300 yards meant German pilots were already firing. By the moment an American tail gunner engaged, cannon shells might already be tearing through his position. Aruth had witnessed this firsthand. On his 6th sortie, a B-17 off Tandaleo's right wing absorbed concentrated fire to its tail section. The rear gunner never discharged a round. The attacking fighter approached at maximum velocity with every weapon firing, and explosive shells penetrated the plexiglass before the American could react. The bomber dropped out of formation, spilling black smoke. 8 parachutes blossomed. The tail gunner did not appear among them. Official doctrine demanded patience and fire discipline. Aruth had begun questioning every element. German interceptors attacked from extended ranges because they had learned American gunners held fire. Luftwaffe pilots had thoroughly studied United States training procedures. They exploited these patterns like reading a navigation chart. When American rear gunners waited until 300 yards, German pilots operated freely at 600 yards. If you're interested in learning how one tail gunner challenged the doctrine, killing his fellow airmen, please press that like button. It assists us in bringing these overlooked accounts to wider audiences. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Staff Sergeant Aruth. 186 flying fortresses departed from multiple airfields across eastern England that morning. 123 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters would provide escort coverage initially, but fuel limitations meant those fighters would break away over Belgium. The bombers would penetrate the final 200 miles to Kassel without protection. Aruth inspected his ammunition belts. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. Training manuals designated that quantity as adequate. Aruth had concluded the manuals were incorrect about everything else. The bomber formation departed the English coastline at 14,000 feet, still climbing. Through his turret transparency, Aruth observed the channel waters falling away, the white cliffs of Dover diminishing behind the formation. Forward lay occupied France, then Belgium, then Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts maintained protective positions around the bomber stream. Their presence provided temporary security. But Aruth comprehended the mathematics. The Thunderbolts carried fuel for 90 minutes of combat. The mission to Kassel required 6 hours. Throughout most of the journey, the bombers would operate without protection. During initial missions, Aruth had rigidly adhered to official doctrine. Wait for enemy fighters to close, line up aim, fire short bursts, conserve ammunition. Training instructors had drilled these principles relentlessly. Ammunition quantities were limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could stretch 800 rounds through an entire mission. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. The Luftwaffe refused. German fighter pilots had systematically analyzed American tactics. They understood American gunners delayed firing until 300 yards. Therefore, Luftwaffe pilots commenced firing at 600 yards, pouring autocannon fire while American gunners held their triggers and waited. By the moment tail gunners returned fire, devastating damage had been inflicted. Aruth had recalculated the problem from a different perspective. A Focke-Wulf at 600 yards was not a difficult target. The fighter was flying directly toward him, nose aimed straight, presenting maximum profile. Closure velocity meant the target's apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who fired early could walk tracer rounds onto the target, adjusting aim as range decreased. The risk was ammunition expenditure. 800 rounds sounded substantial until divided by potential attacks. A mission might encounter 15, 20, possibly 30 attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics became unforgiving. A gunner who engaged early risked exhausting ammunition before completion. Aruth accepted that risk. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died during the third engagement had made a poor bargain. Survival demanded disrupting enemy attacks before they reached firing position. If that meant risking low ammunition, he would confront that problem when necessary. Dead airmen had zero use for remaining ammunition. His initial test arrived during his fourth mission, a bombing strike against submarine facilities at Saint-Nazaire in June. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters positioned for attack from 6 o'clock low. The textbook tail attack. Standard doctrine commanded patience. Aruth commenced firing at 700 yards. Tracer rounds arced across sky, initially falling short, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The Luftwaffe pilot observed incoming fire and abandoned his attack, diving away before achieving autocannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter hit Tandileo. The crew chief interrogated Aruth following landing. Ammunition count revealed he had burned nearly 200 rounds during one engagement. At that rate, he would exhaust ammunition before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Aruth explained his reasoning. The crew chief remained skeptical. Other tail gunners learned about the engagement. Some characterized his tactics as reckless. Expending ammunition on extended range shots violated every principle taught. Training manuals existed for researched reasons. Aruth was gambling with his crew's survival. But Tandileo continued returning. Mission after mission, the bomber touched down with every crew member alive. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron experienced worse outcomes. By mid-July, 3 squadron bombers had been shot down, 30 airmen lost. Now penetrating Belgian airspace on July 30th, Aruth observed the P-47 escorts waggling wings in farewell and banking toward England. Fuel gauges demanded withdrawal. The bombers pressed forward alone. Somewhere ahead, 300 German interceptors waited. Aruth would require every round he had loaded. He would require surviving long enough to employ them. The initial German fighters materialized at 11:42, climbing from the southeast in tactical formations. Aruth counted 8, then 12, then abandoned counting. The sky behind Tandileo filled with black German crosses on yellow spinners. The lead fighter initiated its attack from 6 o'clock high, diving toward the formation at 400 miles per hour. Aruth tracked the approaching aircraft through his gun sight, observing the wingspan enlarging. At 800 yards, he pressed both triggers. The twin Brownings erupted, projecting a stream of tracers across the sky. Initial rounds fell short, vanishing into empty air. Aruth adjusted, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, tracers began impacting. Brilliant flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling as ammunition struck home. The German pilot broke hard right, smoke streaming from his aircraft. He never completed his pass. The crippled fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into clouds below. Aruth had zero time to observe. The second attacker was already accelerating toward the position. This interceptor approached from lower altitude, attempting to slip beneath his field of fire. The angle was challenging, demanding he depress his guns nearly to their stops. He engaged anyway, projecting a burst toward the Focke-Wulf. The German pilot flinched at incoming tracers, prematurely pulling upward and releasing his shells into empty sky above Tandileo. The attacks continued for 47 minutes. Successive waves of German fighters slashed through the formation, selecting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Aruth engaged everything within range, consuming ammunition at triple the recommended rate. His gun barrels began glowing red from sustained fire. At 12:29, a Messerschmitt approached from directly astern, maintaining straight flight. The German pilot demonstrated either courage or poor judgment. Aruth centered the fighter in his sight and held both triggers down. The Browning machine guns roared for 6 continuous seconds, delivering over 100 projectiles into the German aircraft. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in mid-air. The power plant separated from the airframe. Both wings folded backward. The debris tumbled past Tandileo close enough that Aruth could observe the vacant cockpit. The pilot had either bailed out or perished at the controls. 2 confirmed destructions. Ammunition reserves reduced to 180 rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51 and commenced bombing. For 11 minutes, the bombers maintained straight and level flight, unable to maneuver while bombardiers established targeting solutions. The Luftwaffe understood this window represented maximum vulnerability. German fighters intensified their attacks. A Focke-Wulf 190 descended on Tandileo from 5 o'clock. Aruth rotated his weapons to intercept, discharging a brief burst. Projectiles impacted the fighter's wing route. The German pilot maintained approach despite hits, his cannon shells penetrating Tandileo's tail section. Aruth perceived impacts before experiencing pain. 20-millimeter fragments punched through plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and embedding in his left arm and shoulder. His left weapon jammed completely. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment, flash freezing instantly. He maintained fire with the right gun, one-handed. Bleeding, he tracked the damaged Focke-Wulf as it executed pull-out. A final burst engaged the fighter's tail assembly. The aircraft snap-rolled and descended toward terrain. His third confirmed destruction. The intercom crackled with voices. Someone requested damage assessment. Another reported anti-aircraft artillery ahead. Aruth attempted response, but his throat had become desiccated. Blood accumulated on the floor, solidifying instantly in sub-zero temperature. 400 rounds expended. 63 remaining. 3 fighters destroyed. The mission was 50% complete. Tandileo still needed to traverse 250 miles homeward through the identical gauntlet. Aruth secured a scarf around his wounded arm and prepared for subsequent attacks. Homeward flight commenced at 1304. Tandileo reversed course with 185 other bombers, departing Kassel, burning beneath a smoke column. Aruth maintained station, scanning through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe had not concluded operations. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, repositioning along the bomber stream's homeward route. Fresh aircraft substituted for those destroyed during morning engagements. The return gauntlet would prove equally dangerous. Aruth's left arm had become numb from cold and trauma. His jammed weapon remained inoperable. He possessed one functioning weapon and 63 projectiles to provide coverage across 250 miles of hostile airspace. The tactical mathematics demanded revision. At 63 rounds, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of 20 rounds each. Every trigger compression had to achieve maximum effectiveness. Suppressive fire had vanished. At 13:31, a pair of Bf-109s closed from 7 o'clock. Aruth delayed engagement until 500 yards, then discharged a 12-round burst at the lead fighter. Tracers impacted the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt executed an inverted roll and descended, trailing white glycol vapor. The wingman aborted without engaging. 51 rounds remaining. Tandileo crossed into French airspace at 14:15. Fighter attacks diminished as Luftwaffe units reached maximum operational range. By 14:47, the formation had outpaced the final interceptors. The English Channel materialized 20 minutes later. Landing at Kimbolton commenced at 15:52. Aruth could not extract himself without assistance. Ground crew pulled him through the hatch and transported him to a medical ambulance. The flight surgeon enumerated 11 fragmentation wounds across his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Information spread rapidly through the 379th Bombardment Group. The tail gunner on Tandileo had achieved 3 confirmed destructions and 2 probables while wounded, employing a single weapon with 63 rounds remaining. The mission intelligence summary noted his extended range engagement technique as significant in the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began posing questions. Standard Doctrine specified waiting until 300 yards. Aruth had initiated fire at 800. Doctrine emphasized ammunition conservation. Aruth had consumed 700 rounds before sustaining wounds. Official Doctrine was producing deceased gunners. Aruth remained alive. The squadron gunnery officer reviewed combat camera footage. The film demonstrated Aruth's tracers reaching beyond standard range, disrupting German attacks before pilots could establish stable platforms. Extended range fire compelled enemy aircraft to execute defensive maneuvering, degrading accuracy and reducing hits. By mid-August, 3 additional tail gunners had adopted tactical variations. Their survival rates demonstrated measurable improvement. The bombers they defended returned with reduced damage. The correlation became difficult to dismiss. The group commander received a preliminary report on September 1st. Data suggested aggressive extended-range fire reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated attacks. The implications challenged 2 years of established doctrine. Meanwhile, Aruth underwent recovery at the station hospital. The fragmentation damage had avoided major vessels and nerves. The flight surgeon cleared him for duty on August 19th, 3 weeks following Kassel. Tandileo had a replacement aircraft. The original bomber had been written off after accumulating excessive damage. The replacement carried identical name and crew. Aruth returned to the tail position on August 26th. The Luftwaffe had noticed fundamental changes within American formations. Their intelligence officers were studying the emerging problem. Luftwaffe intelligence identified the tactical pattern during early September. American tail gunners were initiating fire earlier, sometimes exceeding 600 yards. The modification disrupted formations that had functioned reliably for months. German pilots reported the shift during debriefings across occupied territories. The approach from 6 o'clock, previously the safest attack angle, was becoming hazardous. American tracers reached outward before German pilots could establish stable platforms. The psychological impact proved significant. A pilot observing tracers streaming toward his aircraft at extended range instinctively executed defensive maneuvering even when projectiles fell short. The Luftwaffe's tactical response developed through 3 phases. Initially, they increased approach velocities, descending at maximum speeds to minimize exposure. Subsequently, they modified attack geometries, approaching from elevated 6 o'clock positions where gravity assisted pullout. Finally, they commenced targeting specific aircraft, demonstrating aggressive gunner behaviors, attempting to eliminate the threat before proliferation. None resolved the fundamental problem. Increased velocities degraded accuracy. Steeper geometries increased tracking difficulty. Targeting aggressive gunners required advanced identification, nearly impossible amid chaotic combat. The 379th flew 11 missions between August 26th and September 5th. Aruth participated in 4, adding 2 confirmed destructions. Other tail gunners claimed 7 additional. The Luftwaffe's attrition ratio against Triangle K bombers was climbing. German commanders attempted concentrated mass tactics. Rather than distributing interceptors across the entire stream, they assembled concentrated forces against individual groups, attempting to overwhelm defensive fire through numerical superiority. The tactic produced results on September 3rd when concentrated attacks against the 100th Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft within 15 minutes. The 379th avoided that slaughter by maintaining different positioning. However, the lesson was unmistakable. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for exploitable weaknesses. The aerial warfare over Europe had evolved into continuous tactical innovation, with each force studying adversary methods and developing countermeasures. Aruth comprehended the stakes. His technique functioned because it surprised enemy forces. Once Germans developed effective responses, the advantage would vanish. Every mission represented a tactical test. Every engagement a data point both forces would analyze. The temporary edge aggressive fire provided was eroding. The mission scheduled for September 6th would target Stuttgart, deep within southern Germany. The route would carry formations across 500 miles of enemy territory, the longest penetration attempted that month. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from multiple bases. Stuttgart manufactured precision ball bearings, components essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon throughout the German arsenal. The strategic importance rendered it among the most heavily defended locations in Europe. Anti-aircraft batteries encircled the city. Fighter squadrons were positioned along every probable approach corridor. The briefing on September 5th laid out challenges. The 379th would fly lead position of the combat wing, assuming responsibility for navigation and bomb aiming. Lead position meant absorbing initial attacks. It meant maintaining straight flight while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could project. Aruth inspected his weapons that evening. Both Brownings had received fresh maintenance, feed mechanisms operating smoothly, barrels replaced. He loaded 1,200 rounds rather than standard 800. The additional ammunition added weight, but weight seemed less important than firepower capacity. Tomorrow would test everything learned. Tomorrow would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission. The Stuttgart mission launched at 0540 on September 6th. 187 bombers climbed into overcast English sky, forming over the North Sea before rotating southeast. Tandaleo maintained flight in the lead element, positioned where Aruth would encounter initial attacks from any vector. German fighters located the formation over France at 0915. Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs rose from regional airfields, climbing to intercept before German airspace. Initial attacks originated from 11 o'clock, head-on passes testing nose gunners. Aruth maintained station, observing contrails multiply behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building concentrated strength, assembling fighters from multiple units. By 0940, intelligence calculated over 100 interceptors tracking the bombers. Rear quarter attacks commenced at 10:08. A staffel of 12 Bf-109s, positioned 2,000 feet below, then executed a climbing attack from 6 o'clock low. Aruth initiated fire at 700 yards, projecting tracers into the lead element. 2 fighters immediately aborted. A third absorbed multiple hits and departed trailing smoke. The remaining 9 pressed forward. Cannon shells penetrated the formation, impacting bombers throughout the combat box. The B-17 off Tandaleo's left wing sustained hits to its number 3 engine. Another bomber commenced trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Aruth maintained continuous fire, transitioning from target to target as fighters streaked through his visual range. His ammunition counter declined progressively, 600 rounds, 500, 400. The attacks demonstrated zero indication of diminishing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 descended on Tandaleo from directly overhead and astern, exploiting solar glare to mask its approach trajectory. Aruth identified the fighter marginally too late. 20-millimeter shells penetrated the tail section before he could orient weapons effectively. The kinetic impacts threw him violently against the plexiglass barrier. His left weapon was catastrophically destroyed, the receiver completely shattered by direct cannon hit. Explosive fragments penetrated his flight suit, creating multiple wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood flowed down his face in substantial volume, partially obscuring vision. He maintained fire with the right gun exclusively. The attacking Focke-Wulf executed pull-out and rolled away, trailing smoke from hits scored during its dive sequence. Aruth cleared blood from his eyes and immediately searched for subsequent attackers. Tandaleo was operationally dying. The fighter's cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, inflicted severe damage to tail controls, and punctured fuel tanks within wing root assemblies. The flight crew struggled to maintain operational altitude, but the aircraft was losing its battle against gravitational forces and compromised control authority. The formation reached Stuttgart at 1104. Tandaleo maintained formation for sufficient duration to release its bomb load over the designated target, then departed formation as accumulated damage overwhelmed compensatory ability. 2 engine assemblies were operating with degraded performance. The fuel supply situation had become critically urgent. The flight crew reached their operational decision over eastern French territory. Tandaleo could not successfully reach England given current damage state and fuel reserves. The optimal available option was executing controlled water ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue units might successfully reach them before hypothermia proved fatal. Aruth maintained his defensive station as the bomber descended, continuously scanning for German fighters that might pursue the obviously crippled aircraft for easy destruction credit. None materialized. The Luftwaffe possessed other priority targets, healthier bombers still maintaining formation. Tandaleo impacted channel waters at 1512, striking the gray surface at 120 miles per hour. The fuselage structure fractured upon impact forces. Aruth was thrown forward violently, his head impacting the gun mount with substantial force. Complete darkness. When consciousness returned, he discovered himself floating within an inflatable life raft. British air-sea rescue vessels were approaching. All 10 crew members had successfully survived the water ditching. The bomber that had transported them through 17 operational missions now rested at the bottom of the English Channel. The 379th Group commander was already formally requesting Aruth's comprehensive mission report documentation. The Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived on October 14, 1943. The second highest military decoration the United States Army could award, recognized Aruth's actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation specifically mentioned his decision to continue firing while wounded, crediting his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. The 8th Air Force Gunnery Staff had completed their analysis by late October. The data covered 14 bomber groups across 3 months of operations. The conclusions challenged assumptions that had governed American air combat since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged targets beyond 500 yards showed measurably higher survival rates than those who followed standard doctrine. The early fire disrupted enemy formations, forcing German pilots to maneuver defensively rather than establishing stable firing platforms. The ammunition cost was significant, but the trade-off favored the aggressive approach. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command Operational Planning, reviewed the findings personally. The implications extended beyond individual aircraft. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt mass fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine might require revision. The formal policy change came in November. New gunnery guidelines authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The bureaucratic language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. The approach that had kept Aruth alive was becoming official doctrine. Aruth never saw the policy take full effect. His head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initial assessments indicated. After returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. Recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty impossible. His final tally stood at 17 confirmed destructions with 4 additional probables awaiting verification. The number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some records credited him with as many as 19 victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise counts difficult. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the time his combat career ended, Aruth had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the winter of 43, the invasion summer of 44, and the final campaigns of 45. The tactics Aruth had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command. Tail gunners across the 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement doctrine. The statistical impact emerged gradually. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple factors contributed. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced exposure to unprotected combat. Improved aircraft systems enhanced survivability. But defensive gunnery also played a role, and the shift toward aggressive fire was part of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew mentioned the increased danger of tail attacks against American formations. The easy destructions that had characterized early bomber interceptions became progressively harder to achieve. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates in exchange for avoiding concentrated rear hemisphere fire. Aruth shipped home to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duties, passing his combat experience to new gunners preparing for overseas deployment. He spent the remainder of the war teaching others the techniques that had kept him alive. The students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, over every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. What he did after the war surprised everyone who knew him. Michael Aruth did not leave military service when the war ended. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe chose to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. The decision puzzled some who knew his history. Aruth had accumulated enough combat experience for several lifetimes. He had been wounded twice, ditched in the English Channel, and faced death more times than official records could capture. Most veterans with similar experiences wanted nothing more than civilian life. Aruth saw it differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives, not just his own, but the crews who flew with him and the gunners who learned from his methods. Walking away felt like abandoning something important. His post-war years were quiet. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, Aruth believed that those who had not been there could never truly understand. Elmer Bendiner, Tandaleo's navigator, took a different path. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses. The book described the crew's experiences in detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history. Bendiner's account ensured that Tandaleo and her crew would not be forgotten. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war. Veterans gathered to remember friends who had not returned, to share stories their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been. Aruth attended, when his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months over Europe. The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received his remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. The headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not mention the 17 fighters he had destroyed, or the crews he had protected, or the doctrine he had helped reshape. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements. The stones mark names and dates, but cannot capture the weight of what those names represent. Aruth lies among thousands of other veterans, each with stories that deserve telling. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are archived there, including mission reports that document Aruth's combat achievements. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear his influence. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like Aruth into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and memorial displays. But the principles he demonstrated, the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that was getting men killed, those principles endure.